here. We have 3 panels, 2 with presentations, and then 1 at the end where we try to wrap things up. But before that, we're very fortunate to have a wonderful keynote speaker. Miranda Schreurs is the director of the Environmental Policy Research Center at the Free University in Berlin. And her organization is one of the partners of our Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue. And it's been a very fruitful partnership for us indeed, because they helped to organize our initial launch event in Berlin some years ago. And that was, I think, a very good start to the project. I was just the other day trying to put some readings on the issue of climate change in Canada and Europe on my 2000 level course, and of course ended up at Miranda's webpage, because she's the one who writes a lot on multi-level governance and environmental policy, and in fact did an article about the Canadian sort of provincial role in environmental policy in Canada for a special issue we did. But I was amazed at the length of her publication list just in the last 2 years. She's an extremely prolific author, writing on a very wide range of topics that I think you'd all find very interesting, so take a look when you get a chance. But her books, she also is the author of several, and co-editor of several books. I won't read all the titles of those, but she's a very active scholar. But beyond that, I think the thing that you'll find very interesting is her role as a policy advisor. She is the chair of the European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Councils, which is a network of advisory councils across Europe. And she also has been called by the German government, by the Chancellor, in fact, to serve as an advisor on some of the German organizations that deal with energy policy. She's, I know, in high demand in terms of getting her policy advice, so she speaks, I think, from a very broad comparative perspective, and therefore is very well placed to introduce our topic, to kind of put this whole environmental topic in Canada and Europe in a broader context, which will then allow us in the panels to drill down to look at the public opinion dimension. So Miranda, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Joan, for that very nice introduction. And thanks also to John for organizing this event. I think it's really important that we have these kinds of transatlantic dialogues. And in Europe, there is tremendous interest in what's going on in North America, including Canada and the United States. There's less knowledge about what's going on in Mexico. But the transatlantic dialogue is really very important. And today, what I want to do is play around with the question of how we can best look at the transatlantic comparison, and then also to give you a little bit of a background of what I see happening, especially in the climate area, but also a little more generally in relationship to sustainable development in both places. And let me first begin by asking you all a question. What actually is the right comparison? If we want to look at Canada on the one hand and Europe on the other, how can we best do this comparison? And if we play around a little bit, you could argue that the best comparison for Canada is Norway, because you have 2 countries with very high per capita GDPs. You have 2 countries that, in a sense, are what you might call middle states in global politics. They're not the superpowers, but they're influential. They're able to shape policies, and people watch them. And they're both very much influenced by larger arrangements. In Norway's case, Norway is part of the European Free Trade Agreement and is therefore very closely integrated into the European Union. And you could say Canada is also very closely integrated into NAFTA and also the relationship to the United States. So in some ways you could say these 2 states are kind of similar. Canada and the United States are both, in a way, agenda setters, but they're constrained a little bit, or a lot, by their relationship to larger neighbors to the south. Norway's environmental policies are very much influenced by the European Union. Canada's, I believe, also very much by the United States. 2 countries, both very attractive places to go to, lots of environmental tourism, known as being leaders in sustainable development. Both can boast very, very high percentages of hydropower in their electricity mixes, clean energy as part of that electricity mix. Rich countries, and they will remain rich countries because of the resources available to both. Both have, as I mentioned, done a lot in sustainability, and they like to have that image of sustainability. And both have a big Achilles heel to deal with. Oil in the case of Norway, oil sands in the case of Canada. So that image of sustainability, being highly ranked countries on environmental protection, always has to somehow deal with the Achilles heel. How do you deal with the fact that Canada's got very high CO2 emissions tied to the oil sands, and in Norway tied to the offshore oil drilling? So in that sense, I think Norway and Canada are very interesting. But we can also play with a comparison Canada and the European Union. If we do it this way, we think of Canada, federalist structure, provinces that are very powerful. In fact, there's a limit to how much agenda setting the federal government can do because of the power of the provinces. Same way in the European Union, you can argue you basically have a federal, a supranational is how we talk about it in Europe, a supranational structure with very powerful member states. So that constrains the ability of Brussels to completely set the agenda. And if we look within the two countries, well, the European Union is not a country, within the two federal structures, we could also play around with how would you compare states and provinces. And let me just throw out a couple of ideas. If we were to compare Poland with Alberta, Poland is the country that is 80% dependent on coal, and so it has very high per capita CO2 emissions within the European Union. Alberta, with its very rich fossil fuel reserves, is in a similar boat. Very high per capita fossil fuel emissions if you're looking at Alberta. We could then take Quebec, and I'd say let's pair it with Sweden. Lots of hydropower and some nuclear. And the idea in both is to see if you can't go low carbon by 2050 and basically be carbon neutral. So very similar developments there. I had a little more trouble when I was thinking about, well, what about Ontario? And as you'll see in a little bit, you could play around and say maybe Ontario and Germany. It doesn't work quite as well. But both have some reliance on coal, on nuclear, and in both there's efforts to pursue more new renewables, i.e. wind and solar. So in terms of which comparison, is Norway, Canada, or EU, Canada better? I think it depends more what your question is. But if we stick to the federal and supranational kind of comparison, then it's also interesting to think, how do we look at them as federal systems trying to shape global policies on issues like climate change? And here the EU likes to present itself as a front runner, and in some ways is a front runner. The EU has the goals 20-20-20 by 2020, 20% renewables in the total energy mix, which means transport, heating fuels, plus electricity. 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions relative to 1990 levels, and 20% improvement in energy efficiency. Actually, the energy efficiency improvement target and the greenhouse gas emission reduction target are pretty closely tied together. If you improve efficiency, you reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the EU has pushed very hard internationally, globally, on the Kyoto Protocol. You could probably argue that it is largely Europe's leadership that kept the Kyoto Protocol alive. And it's also Europe's leadership that has kept the Kyoto Protocol alive in the second commitment period. You may or may not be familiar that the Kyoto Protocol ran out December 31st of 2012. The first commitment period ended. And so there was a lot of question in the international arena, what happens post first phase Kyoto? And in the international annual conferences of the UN Convention on Climate Change, they came up with an arrangement to continue the Kyoto Protocol for another 7 years through 2012. The EU has its target of 20% under that second commitment period, and has said they'll go to 30% if other major players like Canada, like the United States, agree to do something comparable. Canada, in the international climate negotiations, has positioned itself closely with the United States. In fact, this is where I can ask whether or not Canada is really an independent player on the climate change case, because Canada said its position would depend on what the United States does, and basically took the same target that the United States has done, minus 17% of 2005 greenhouse gas emissions by 2020. It's a non-binding target. The EU targets are binding. They're written into law. So in the Canadian case, you do have a target. This target, however, is no longer tied to the Kyoto Protocol, because Canada, as you know, pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol, largely because Canada wasn't meeting its greenhouse gas emission targets. There was really no way Canada was going to be able to fulfill its promises, and thus Canada is pulled out, and it's not part of the second phase. So if you're in Europe and you look at Canada, Canada's image is not so great. Excuse me. Canada is seen as the player that is dragging the Kyoto Protocol negotiations in the wrong direction. So, the federal level, you might argue that Europe is outperforming Canada. And I think in a lot of indicators that's probably true. But is that really the only comparison we should be making? And this is where I think looking at Canada as a federal structure and looking at the role of the provinces is also very revealing. If we look on a state-by-state basis within Europe and a province-by-province basis within Canada, the picture looks rather different in the story also. But first, a couple of indicators that have been developed by various groups ranking countries on how they do. Yale University has, for the last decade, been producing an environmental performance index. And what that index does is it looks at countries across various environmental areas, so water policy, air pollution, nature conservation, and it gives them points in each of these categories, adds them up, and says who are the best performers all around. If we look at the best performers all around, the top 10, you see Europe dominates. Switzerland, Latvia, Norway, Luxembourg. Costa Rica, a very interesting exception, the only Latin American country that performs so high. France, Austria, Italy, the United Kingdom, Sweden, and Germany didn't quite make it into the top 10, number 11. North America is a little bit further down on the list. You'll see that we have Canada here at 37, outperforming the United States, ranked at 49. So once again, this is overall performance. It's not just climate change. There's another index out there, which is the Climate Change Performance Index. I think you can tell I'm losing my voice here. This isn't good. Climate Change Performance Index is put together by a group called German Watch. And German Watch has decided that no countries deserve to be in positions 1, 2, or 3, and therefore they leave those blank. The index changes year to year. It rates performance a little differently than Environmental Performance Index does. First, it's only looking at climate change. And second, it doesn't just look at environmental outcome, it also looks at policy input. So what it tries to do is to measure how are countries doing if you look at what are the trends in greenhouse gas emissions relative to the previous year, and what kinds of policies do they have in place, and what are they doing to try to change the trajectory of their greenhouse gas emissions. Denmark, which has a policy of being carbon neutral, has the highest ranking. That's the country where if you want to move around, you get yourself a bicycle. And they really are pushing very, very hard to transform their electricity sector into a completely renewable energy-based sector. Wind power is very dominant there, and they're well on the way of meeting this goal. Sweden also has a carbon neutral target, and similar to Denmark, have been doing a lot with renewable energies. They're doing a lot with changing transportation structures. They are, unlike Denmark, also a nuclear state, doing nuclear energy. Maybe a little surprising that Portugal ranks that highly in this list, in part because they've pushed so hard on the development of new renewables in the last couple of years, and so that really has improved their performance. But here we see the same kind of outcome as with the Environmental Performance Index, that the United States and Canada, they're not at the bottom of the list. The bottom of the list goes down to 100-something, and there you find countries that are very poor countries. But they're middle ranked, and the performance isn't putting them up there as the leaders. In part, that is the carbon dioxide emission trends that we've had here in Canada. At the federal level, if we look at what's going on with CO2 emissions, they have been rising. So the goal under the Kyoto Protocol was to reduce the emissions below 1990 levels. I think Canada's target was -6%. But instead, the Canadian emissions have increased, and then you had financial crisis here. And with a financial crisis, a bit of a reduction in those emissions. But overall emissions in Canada are 20-some% higher than they were back in 1990. So the trend has been very much in the wrong direction on overall CO2 emissions. Europe can boast somewhat better performance here. Here you have two graph lines. And you see trends in CO2 emissions, expected change in total greenhouse gas emissions for the EU 27, and this is for the EU 15. The difference is that EU 15 countries are those countries that were part of the EU when the Kyoto Protocol was formulated. And so in Europe, we talk about the EU 15. Those are the basically richer Western European countries. The EU 27 includes all of the new member states that joined between 2004 and 2007. So the Central and European states, and more recently, we'll be adding a couple of states from the Baltic region. Croatia's now accepted as a accession country, so they'll be joining the EU soon. But anyhow, if you look at this, what we see are kind of similar trends in what's been going on with emissions. And the emission changes have a lot to do with the collapse of the old Soviet economies. That's even true for the EU 15 because of Germany. Germany was one of the biggest emitters within the EU, and so a big drop in the emissions in Germany as a result of the shutdown of the East German industries helped reduce emissions in those first years, and hence these relatively sharp drops in the first years after unification in Germany and transition in the rest of the Soviet bloc. And more recently, some continued trends in emissions, more sharply reduced trends here, partly financial crisis, partly we're starting to see the real push on renewable energy. EU 27 right now is something like 27% below 1990 CO2 emission levels. So the EU as a whole has met the Kyoto Protocol targets. The EU 15 had a -8% target, and they will very easily reach it. They will exceed it. Right now, estimates are that they'll be somewhere at -12 or 13%. So what we see is in Europe, downward trends. If we look at Canada and we look at different provinces, it's also the reality that we have very different energy structures. And I chose Ontario to look at, in part because Ontario, for me, is one of the bigger industrial areas in Canada, and therefore you'd expect a region with higher CO2 emissions. Ontario doesn't do too badly on the CO2 emissions, although it does have coal still and the nuclear. But the question is, what is going to happen with nuclear in the long run? Will it continue or not? My guess in Canada, yes. In the European case, we'll see that there's a very different picture going on. Here we see the same kind of graphs for the various Canadian provinces. And what you see, again, is very different mixes of energy that's available to provinces. So if you are here in Quebec, you've got yourself a system that's basically based on hydro. So Quebec, if we were to do those environmental performance index rankings or the climate change performance rankings, not based by country, but instead by province, then I think Quebec would rank probably very high in the picture. Ontario would not rank quite as high because they have a higher CO2 emission mix, but they've got policies put in place to phase out the old coal-fired power plants. So I think one of the things we have to look at much more closely when we're doing these comparisons is what does it mean when we look with different levels of revolution? If we focus more specifically on individual provinces or individual states, we really do get very different performances. Alberta here, this is the fossil fuels, that the coal and fossil fuels that are dominating the scene. And so there you would have a performance that would look very far down if you were to do it on the Environmental Performance Index or the Climate Change Index. A little bit about what's going on in Europe. The efforts to change climate policy in Europe have some background to them. And I think when we get into the statistical comparisons about trends in attitudes on climate change, this background will become quite useful. One is that the EU is, when you take the countries as a whole, a very big emitter. It's the third largest emitter if you take all of the EU 27 countries as a whole. If you take them separately, Germany is the sixth largest CO2 emitter. And then you have England and Italy also in the top 12. So if you take it as a whole, it's very big. The other reality for Europe, quite different from Canada, is energy dependency. Europe is very dependent on energy imports. Europe needs to import much of its energy. A lot of it comes from Russia, some from the Middle East. And that energy import dependency is rising. In the small European countries, if you're up in Latvia, Estonia, you are doing 100% import on energy. If you are in countries like Germany, you're at 56, 57% and rising. France, a little bit less so. Nevertheless, overall dependency is very high. So in Europe, there's a lot of concerns about long-term economic competitiveness. What's the possibility for Europe to remain economically competitive if it has to import so much energy? And therefore, a lot of interest in what can be done to reduce the amount of energy that's imported and see if there are ways of making Europe a whole lot more energy efficient. So both climate change and concerns about energy dependency and economic competitiveness are driving big policy changes in Europe. Europe as a whole has a goal for 2050. It's a non-binding goal of an 80 to 95% emission reduction by 2050 relative to 1990 levels. Basically what that means is an energy revolution. Basically what that means is no more coal, gas, oil, and switching to renewables and high energy efficiency. Clearly there'll still be some fossil fuels in the mix. It's relative to 1990 levels, so it's not completely cutting those out. But it's very greatly reducing dependency on fossil fuels. So that in the future, maybe Europe will look like this, where Europe is sharing renewable energy across countries, linking them up in an interconnected grid system, where Norway's sharing it's already 100% renewable. It would be quite easy for Norway to further expand its renewables, export that renewables to places like Poland and Germany, do solar power around the Mediterranean, biomass in eastern parts of Europe, mix it all together, and then you have a system that goes very low carbon. Challenges related to do this are the fact that France is 80% nuclear in its electricity mix. Germany is still a mixture of coal, nuclear, and increasingly renewables, but it still has a ways to go in making the transition to low carbon. And Poland is about 80% coal. So Europe's goals for 2050 are there, but we still don't have the policies in place to make Europe reach that 2050 goal. We see the different targets. When I said Europe has a 20-20-20 target for 2020, it didn't tell you that those targets are different country by country. 20-20-20 is averaged across Europe. So if we look at the different countries, we have countries like Belgium that have a goal 13% renewables in their total energy mix, or countries like Sweden, 49% for 2020. And that's partly because of the different energy possibilities of those states. The possibilities for Sweden, which has so much hydro, are much better than the possibilities for a country like Belgium or Bulgaria, where you have less wind, you don't have that much sun, and so the challenge of doing more renewables is bigger. Graphically, it looks like this. You see countries, and this is their 2020 goals. There's big differences. These are the Scandinavian countries here. And Germany, which is considered a leader in the development of renewables, is only down here. So Germany is considered a leader in renewables primarily because it's pushing new renewables, wind, solar, to some extent biomass, but not the traditional hydro, because Germany doesn't have that much hydro. Most of the renewables you see here now are tied to hydro. Also in Europe, what we see are lots of trends which suggest really strong interest on the parts of communities in Europe to show that they are taking climate change seriously, that they are very interested in transforming their cities into being next generation cities, the leaders in greenhouse gas emission reductions, leaders in renewables, leaders in new technologies. So they're now European Green City Awards. Germany is within Europe, probably together with England and Sweden, arguably from the southern European country, Spain, one of the countries that's pushing hardest on the transition. And the reason Germany is getting so much attention is because Germany has a industrial-based economy. Germany produces coal-fired power plants that are fueling the automobile industry and the steel industry. Germany has nuclear power, which has also been pushing the manufacturing sector. As those transition out, one of the big challenges is how do you continue to be an industrial-based country and promote more and more renewables? So what we're looking at in Germany is what's the potential of doing a lot of offshore wind? What's the potential of connecting that with pumped storage power for hydro so you can save electricity for the days when there's no wind? doing more with solar power and connecting Germany, much like I showed you that map of Europe, into a system that goes low carbon. In the German case, this means reaching pretty substantial targets. Germany's 2020 targets are a little bit higher than the European average. 2020 targets mean a 40% reduction by 2020 of the greenhouse gas emissions relative to 1990 levels. For Germany, that's doable. Germany right now is somewhere around 25 to 28% below 1990 levels. So it still has a ways to go, but it's moving very strongly in that direction. Its goal in the electricity sector is to have 35% of its electricity from renewables by 2020. In 1990, it was 3%. So the push is to very much go green, and eventually by 2050 to have the 80 to 95% target, which Europe has as a German target in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And in order to do that, 80% of electricity from renewables and 60% from the total energy mix. The idea for Germany is if Germany can do it, then probably Europe can do it. Germany is an economic driver, an economic engine in much of Europe, and there's some thinking that if you can create a new model, then you'll have a potential to influence developments in other countries. So very, very big push in photovoltaics in Germany. We have seen in Germany in the last 2 years alone, double the amount of solar power capacity put in as the 8 nuclear power plants that were shut down after Fukushima. So the Fukushima nuclear accident in Germany led to a really sharp turn away from nuclear power, a decision to shut down the nuclear power plants, and the first 8 were shut down right away. This has replaced that capacity. The only problem is the sun doesn't shine that much in Germany. And it also doesn't shine at night. And so what we are seeing right now is that Germany is starting to import more coal from North America to replace the base power load that it's missing, because the renewables haven't completely caught up for production, especially in the wintertime. And wind power also increasing very substantially, big changes. This is onshore wind, and eventually more offshore wind is expected. So the idea of the transition is also changing the landscape. Lots of wind turbines going up everywhere. I personally find them kind of fun. You ride the train and you see the wind turbines out of the window, and they're kind of mesmerizing. You're watching them spin around. Or when they're not spinning, you think, why aren't they spinning? What's going wrong today? There's wind up there. How come they're not spinning? But there are places where the wind parks are also very large, and I'll talk a little bit about public acceptance and a little bit about it. So where's Germany stand now in its energy mix? This is kind of the amazing thing. Germany now gets almost 5% of its electricity from photovoltaics. In order to do that, Germany has 50% of the world's installed photovoltaic capacity. That's because there really isn't enough sun in Germany. So even though they have huge amounts of photovoltaics everywhere, it's generating, 5% isn't small. It's actually huge. But relative to the amount of photovoltaic, if that were in Spain instead, or if that were in Italy, it probably would be producing 15% of that country's electricity mix. And then wind, which is supposed to be the dominant new renewable in Germany, is now at about 7%. And I mention this because one of the very interesting things that's going on with this energy transition is it is, in a way, a policy that's being brought about by pressures from below, but action from the top. And the policies don't always make enough sense. This is what's going on with investment in renewables in Germany, and it's by different kind of electricity. About 80% of all investment in new renewables in Germany has been in photovoltaics. And that is too much given the limited amount of sunshine in Germany. Instead, we should be having that investment going into wind or other kinds of renewables that are more efficient in a country like Germany. I'm not saying some photovoltaics isn't a good thing. It's a complement to the wind. But the relative amount of investment in the different areas doesn't make so much sense. And that's partly because the policy design behind promotion of renewables was developed for a time when there weren't a lot of renewables. And so they gave very, very favorable investment conditions for photovoltaics and also for wind. But for photovoltaics, they're so enormously beneficial that there's been a rush to invest in photovoltaics and capture the profit that comes from it, with the problem that energy prices are now rising. So in 2008, before those big pushes on renewables, right here, this is 2000. Germany put a new renewable law in place here. Then you see this takeoff in wind. And up until about 2006, 7, well, I guess it was already getting quite large here, but the cost impact on the consumer wasn't that bad yet. On photovoltaics, what we see, in 2000, the new law went in place. Investors started to move in, and here, all of a sudden, it skyrockets. And what has happened as a result is that the electricity prices in Germany are now skyrocketing. It's not completely, but it's largely the success of the photovoltaic industry. As of this year, you're paying 5 € extra for every kilowatt hour because of the renewables. And it will increase again next year. So this is the big challenge for Europe right now. The same kind of pattern has been visible in some other European states. So Europe, if it's going to continue with its renewable energy transition, still needs to do some work in thinking about how do you make it function so that the prices don't break the bank. Right now, the data suggests that Europeans are still willing to pay higher prices for electricity. The question is how long and how much, and that's what we don't know. What we do see, this is some data that comes out of the Eurobarometer studies, looking at attitudes towards what do you see as the single biggest problem facing the planet. And in Europe, the single biggest problem is seen as poverty. The second biggest problem is seen as climate change. And this is 2011 data, so it's even after the financial crisis and the euro crisis. Although there's some differences, the darker the color, the higher you're concerned about the problem. What percentage of people were saying it was their highest concern. If we look at it in the case of Germany, what we're seeing is performance that varies a little bit region by region, and we'll also see that support levels are somewhat tied to that. If we look at the data for how are regions within Germany doing on renewables, Brandenburg, here on the top, is ranked #1 in introduction of renewables. That's the area around Germany, or around Berlin. This area is ranked so highly because a lot of the wind parks have been put into this region. It, in a way, has been a very attractive development because it's a rural area. There's been a lot of unemployment. There's a lot of people in Eastern Germany who have lost jobs and have left the regions. So in a way, it's seen as a new possibility for jobs and also for income generation. But as a result of the very large number of investors in that area, there's also the highest level of concern about the development of new renewables. So the data suggests that in Brandenburg, the opposition to new renewables is highest right now. So there is some concern that we need to think about. As prices go up, as wind parks expand, how do you keep this transition going? And this is one of the things that we're struggling with right now. How do we make sure that in Europe, this doesn't become the response to the transitions that are going on? I know that this is also very much an issue here in Canada, looking at wind park development in particular, that there's concerns about having it in my backyard. In Brandenburg, there have been a number of movements that have formed that are not in my backyard movements. Interestingly, those movements tend to be in places where the public hasn't been sufficiently incorporated into the decision-making processes. So the more people have been part of the decision-making, the higher the levels of acceptance seem to be. The other thing we're seeing is that those cities that manage to find ways to allow for some of the profits to flow back into the community, so that the profits don't just go to a big company that take them and use them somewhere else, but if it goes back into the community, then there tends to be less opposition. But it is a big question, and it's a big question because for the next phase of this energy transition, it doesn't mean just more wind parks. It also means more high voltage electricity grid infrastructure. Because if you want to get the electricity from Northern Europe, where you have lots of wind, into Central Europe or into Central Germany, you also need electricity grid structures that can handle it. And there's considerable concern by communities about what that means for their communities. Are there health implications, or those monster masses? They're much bigger than the traditional grid infrastructure. They're larger, they're more visible. Do you want it in your backyard? Some people say just bury it underground. Sounds attractive, but it's 5 times more expensive. And it's not necessarily environmentally the better option. So that's some of the big questions that are being considered right now in Germany. How do we make sure that we don't lose public acceptance for the transition? This is data that says how supportive are you of a further development of renewable energy? When I said that the opposition is getting stronger, we still see that it's not very low. In Brandenburg, still 87% of the people are supporting further development. So it's a minority that's opposed. And in some areas, we've got data that's saying 97% of the provinces, the German Länder, are saying we need more, keep developing. But again, one of the big questions is how long can that go on with rising prices? So I'd like to end the presentation here, but maybe just very quickly to say in the case of Canada, I think for looking at the Canadian situation, it's useful to think about if we were to look at Canada like Europe, what would the picture look like? Different provinces instead of looking at Canada as a whole. And the second thing I think is with Europe being somewhat ahead in the development of the new renewables, may be very important to think about what kind of lessons Europe has for Canada in thinking about how do you deal with public opinion and public acceptance of these kinds of transitions. And as a last thought, for any of you who, doesn't look like there's too many students in the room, but if any students need a new paper topic, to think about how does the new developments in natural gas and shale gas impact all of this big question. Just yesterday, or today, this morning's Washington Post has a big article that says Europe is importing more fossil fuels than ever before. And part of that is because countries are shutting down nuclear, And so they need to replace the base load. And it's partly because the energy revolution here in North America is driving down fossil fuel prices. And so coal's becoming cheaper and oil's becoming cheaper, and there's growing demand for that in Europe. So that could be one of the other big challenges to this kind of energy transition. Thanks very much.